All right, good afternoon. We are continuing on to chapter 8. And up to this point, we've been discussing all the different stresses and all the different kind of laws that apply, stresses on police behavior, and then the laws that apply. Now we're looking at accountability. What happens when things go wrong? So what we're going to be talking about is constitutional policing and police legitimacy. Constitutional policing refers to the idea that there are police policies and practices that are intended to protect the citizens' rights and provide equal protection under the law. What distinguishes the police in the United States from police in more autocratic countries is that police may not be perfect at it, but police are bound by certain rules and certain constitutional principles that are intended to protect the rights of the individual. When we talk about the concept of police legitimacy, what we're talking about is the extent to which the public believes or recognizes that the police have a legitimate function, a function that is indispensable, it's appropriate, it's proper, it's justified, and that's in the best interest of the community. As we've sort of danced around this up to this point in the course, but one of the sort of integral aspects of police behavior or the police job is there are going to be times where the police are going to have to use force. And the question is, and it's a question that we can discuss as a class, is what are acceptable forms of use of force and what are not acceptable forms of use of force. The sort of general view is legitimate responsive forms of force, right of self-defense or in defense of others, power to control those for whom one is responsible. In other words, parents have responsibility to control their children. And then the authority of the police to use reasonable force under the circumstances. So the police use of force, there's fancy ways of describing it. Distribution of non-negotiably coercive remedies. It ranges from making arrests, dispersing unlawful assembly, rioting, protection of the public and the police. There are legal restrictions. Common law fleeing felon rule authorizes the use of deadly force to apprehend all fleeing felons. So what we're talking about is prior to Tennessee versus Garner, the rule was if you were a fleeing felon, the police could use deadly force to stop you, even if the felony that you were committing was not a crime of violence. Tennessee versus Garner sort of established that there is a limit on the use of deadly force. Use of deadly force as of 1985 prevents the escape of all felons that pose an immediate danger to the physical safety of others. So it's imposed a reasonableness standard on the use of deadly force. Similarly, in Graham versus Connor, the reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, rather than with the 20/20 vision of hindsight. The idea is that we can't armchair quarterback use of force. We have to put ourselves in the situation that the police officer was in to decide whether or not the use of force was reasonable. The factors that you're going to look at are going to be things like nature and severity of the offense, level of resistance, level of dangerousness to the police and the public allowed to escape. And this is where if you think about it, we talk about like high-speed chases for someone who's committed a simple traffic offense. Those that kind of use of force or that kind of behavior on the part of the police is rapidly approaching the point where that's not going to be deemed to be reasonable behavior on the part of the police. Most police agencies have a use of force continuum. And what that means is that the police officers are trained to use the minimum amount of force under the circumstances, and then sort of move through those from less violent to more violent, depending on the particular situation. So starts off with verbal direction, officers' presence, touch control, putting your hand on people, but not applying any kind of force to the touch. Empty hand tactics and chemical agents, pepper spray, gas, tasers, the next step, and then handheld impact weapons, asps, billy clubs, those sorts of things. Some jurisdictions, they have firearms that fire beanbags or rubber bullets, and then use of the police canine, and then obviously use of a firearm. So this is another example of the way it looks: presence of verbal commands ranging all the way up to deadly force. Many critics of the use of force continuum say that the sequential continuum is probably too simple and also not realistic in terms of how the police have to deal with people on the street. Doesn't represent the dynamic. There's the contact between the police and the citizen is fast and fluid and changes quickly over time. So it's dynamic. It also doesn't consider the wider range of tools that are available to the officer. So now many agencies now require officers to be objectively reasonable and without having to like hold them to the standard of going through the use of force continuum. And this is just a model for that, where they say dynamic resistance, passive resistance, aggressive resistance changes what it is that you use. The dynamic resistance model, it combines the use of force continuum with the application of 4 broad categories, right? So dynamic resistance, suspect controls interaction, and then the only purpose of the application of force is to gain compliance, right? But this is a lesson learned through demonstrations. Police respond to a crowd will determine the crowd's reaction. Response should be proportional to what is happening during the demonstration. So even if someone's demonstrating but they're not violent, like the fact that the demonstration might be illegal doesn't justify certain higher levels of use of force. And then obviously police are now being taught to consider the optics of their response. You avoid displaying heavy equipment, riot gear. That's the moving away from the military model where the police look like that they are actually just another version of the military. Moving on, we talk about police brutality, which is like the excessive use of force. It can be physical abuse, it can be verbal abuse, it can be symbolic brutality, the idea of being making threatening remarks or threatening behavior. Includes wide ranges of practices from abusive language to physical violence. If it's low visibility, in other words, it occurs in a place where there are a bunch of witnesses, unfortunately, the public or victims have a tendency not to report them. Vehicle pursuits, as we described earlier, in 2007, Supreme Court decision considered the amount of force police may use during a high-speed pursuit. And the question is, does the danger created by the fleeing motorist justify the use of the deadly force? And I think we're coming to find out over time is most of the time that high-speed chase or pursuit is not required or commensurate with the reason for the stop. And then we look at police shootings and assaults. The relative number, or what we call the base rate, instances of the police firing their service weapon is fairly low, and actually the incidence of actual assaultive behavior involving the police is actually relatively low. We hear a lot about it, and the reason why we hear a lot about it is because it's the kind of thing that the public wants to know about, so it receives a lot of media attention. But this is one of the questions that we want to ask is anytime you hear about behavior, especially like the police, the first question you should be asking yourself is, well, what's the base rate? How often does it actually happen? Of the hundreds of thousands of police citizen encounters that take place yearly, what's the actual number that involve a police shooting or a police assault? And how does that compare to the total number? Because if it's a really, really infinitesimally small number, which oftentimes it is, then you have to ask yourself, like, how much or what level of change is required. Not saying that you don't address those individual instances, but when you're talking about broader changes in policing, whether or not you ask yourself whether or not that makes sense given the incidents of occurring. Obviously, there's certain kinds of use of force and certain kinds of use of firearms that we care about, and one of them is that if it appears to be the victim is minority, and the problem is that often it does, and that by itself is more than sufficient reason to have a look at that and try to find out whether or not that is a function of how we police, or what areas we police, or whether it has something to do with the kind of police officers we're recruiting or how we're training police officers. Some police agencies have instituted some early intervention systems to identify potentially problematic officers who have use of force incidents more frequently than others. Will normally generate some increased attention by their superiors to sort of kind of get a handle on why they seem to be participating more frequently in use of force. Police ethics. Most police agencies have ethical rules. It's essentially setting up accountability for police actions. Police are supposed to treat all persons with dignity and respect. They're required to use no more force than is necessary. They're to not demonstrate bias. They should strive to be trained. If they have not received sufficient training, they need to seek out ways to obtain additional training. And then there should be an adequate, what they call standard operating procedures, SOPs, adequate policies, procedures, rules that guide the police officer and also guide the public as to what the police can and cannot do. Your book, I think, has 3 different examples of policies or case studies that discuss the policies, and there's some others in here. And probably as part of one of our exercises, we'll have you look at a local set of policies and procedures and think about what has been included, think about what may have been left out, and think about the sufficiency of those policies. Police misconduct or corruption. It's the oldest problem in American policing. Over the years, there have been lots of efforts to try to get at police misconduct or corruption. One of the problems is inherent in policing is police carry around a tremendous amount of power. And when used correctly, it can address public ills or societal's needs incredibly well. If it is abused, then it is police are in a unique position to not only participate in misconduct or corruption, but also get away with it. So as I indicated before, there have been lots of commissions that have looked at police misconduct, police corruption. The Knapp Commission in the 1970s, looking at the characteristics of individual officers, because that's the key factor influencing among the graft. And graft is essentially taking money for protection. Other factors affecting opportunities for corruption include branch of department, type of assignment, rank. Undercover officers, by definition, have less supervision, and if they are inclined to participate in police misconduct or corruption, it's easier for them to do it without getting caught. Definitions, definition of police misconduct: misuse of authority by police officer in a manner designed to produce personal gain for the officer or others. And corruption is not limited to monetary gain. Gains may include services received, status, influence, prestige, future support for the officer or another. And misconduct is not doing something that is a required duty. Yeah. I'm sorry. Misconduct is not doing something that is a required duty, either administratively or procedurally. There's external corruption, activities that occur from police contacts with the public. The traditional one that you see on TV, where you have police officers who are going into businesses and making the businesses pay for protection, that kind of thing. There's also internal corruption, relationships among officers within the workings of the department, officers who provide internal rewards for services, payments to join the force, to get better shifts or assignments, to receive promotions. All kinds of different forms of this: mooching, chiseling, favoritism, prejudice, bribery, shakedowns, lying to protect each other, and outright theft. The most common extensive form of corruption is receipt of gratuities or tips. And there's always a question of whether small gratuities can create an expectation of some patronage or favor in return. We've always heard about the police officer who gets either free meals or low-cost meals from fast food restaurants. Whether, if it's under $10, does that really matter to the public? At what point, what's the break point where you would say that feels like it's more than just thanking people for their service? Officers should be given formal written guidelines on soliciting and accepting gifts and gratuities. So when you're looking at those policies, those standard operating procedures, you want to look to see if there's anything that covers that issue of what kind of gratuities can the police accept. Overlaying all of this is there's a historical code of silence. It's the thin blue line. It's the idea that police protect their own, and up until the George Floyd case, it was incredibly rare for police officers to testify against each other. Historically, police officers would find ways to not be required to testify against another officer. The George Floyd case was the exception, when you had police officers who were on the street and who had asked the officer to let George Floyd up, or to take the knee off of his neck. Those officers testified, and those officers testified that what the officer did was wrong. The code of silence is keeping quiet in face of misconduct by others. NIJ, National Institute of Justice survey, found 83% of officers in the U.S. do not accept the code of silence as an essential part of the mutual trust. That didn't used to be the case. That's a relatively new phenomenon. Obviously, because it exists, and we know it exists, there are all kinds of different efforts that are being used to address police misconduct and corruption. The Hobbs Act, 1951, expanded federal powers to investigate and prosecute police corruptions. There are whole sections of the U.S. Justice Department that's all they do is look at police corruption. They look at extortion and commerce, internal corruption, acceptance, isolated gratuities are areas of corruptions. Federal perjury statute, federal false sworn declaration statute are also used by prosecutors. Some time ago, there was limitations by virtue of the kind of employment that police officers don't have the same constitutional rights as regular citizens. Officers may be compelled to give up certain rights in investigations of on-duty misbehavior or illegal acts. Federal courts have placed limitations on the officers' constitutional rights. Courts have held the police more accountable because of higher standards by their occupation. as I indicated previously, the use of the polygraph in administrative investigations is interesting in light of the fact that they are scientifically unreliable. Police officers can be compelled to testify or to speak. They can be compelled to allow searches and seizures. They have limitations on their right against self-incrimination, those kinds of things. There can be residency requirements that says for you to work in this jurisdiction, you have to live in this jurisdiction. There are limitations on outside employment, what they call moonlighting. And then obviously the interaction of all this with alcohol and drug abuse. Courts have upheld policies prohibiting alcohol use within a specific period of reporting for duty. There's cases where whole shifts would meet for drinks before they went on shift. Most jurisdictions now have outlawed that. Mandatory drug and alcohol testing. Government may prohibit the use of marijuana even though it's otherwise a legal substance now. When we talk about Brady material, we're talking about when someone is charged with a criminal offense, the state is required to turn over certain information that they intend to use against the suspect at trial. And it's things like statements that you think the defendant has made that you intend to use against him, prior record, certificates of analysis, any evidence that's in the possession of the state, which includes the prosecution office and the police, anything that's in the possession of the state that tends to either suggest that the defendant is not guilty or less culpable than other people who were involved in the crime, and also any evidence that could mitigate sentence, right? That again shows that maybe this particular defendant wasn't as active in the crime as other co-defendants, that sort of thing. A police department must advise a prosecutor if the officer has credibility issues. It's called there are a couple of different current terms for it, but if the police officer is caught lying by the police department has to notify the prosecutor's office that this police officer has credibility issues. So the prosecution can decide whether to use this police officer as a witness, and also to turn over to the defense if the officer does testify to say that he's been caught in a lie before. When we talk about Brady material, we're talking about Brady versus Maryland's 1963 case, and it's the case that that says that the state, including the prosecutor and the police, have to turn over all of this evidence. Police officer use of social networking. Most law enforcement agencies have restrictions on how police can use social networking. Officers have to assume that anything that they post on social networking sites are going to be visible to everybody. As I indicated, there are those policies. There's a model policy on social network, IACP. You can look that up on Google to see what that is. There should be public disciplinary policies and practices where the public can go and see what policies and practices are in place to address police misbehavior. The public expects agencies that will make every effort to identify and correct problems and to respond to citizen complaints. Two kinds of discipline: employee misconduct and then violations of policy. In most instances, police officers do have due process rights, like in things that they are entitled to before they are punished for alleged misconduct. Right? Well-established minimum due process requirements for discharging public employees, that sort of thing. So let's talk a little bit about misconduct complaints. Personal complaint is an allegation of misconduct or illegal behavior. It could be an internal complaint made. In other words, one police officer says another police officer somehow misbehaved. And it could be external complaint where the public makes a complaint against the way they were treated by a police officer. There are lots and lots and lots of anonymous complaints. You can imagine why is that people don't want to, out of fear of reprisal, they will call in anonymously and make a complaint against an officer. They're hard to investigate because without witnesses, it's hard to confirm or dispel the allegation. Misconduct complaints can be handled formally or informally, depends on the seriousness. Most complaints fall into categories like verbal abuse, discourtesy, harassment, improper attitude, or racial or ethnic slurs. And then those with less power, fewer resources are more likely to file complaints and allege more serious forms of misconduct. The typical complaint process: complaint is referred to a senior officer, determine the nature of it. It's referred to the employer's direct supervisor for initial investigation. Now, keep in mind, this is something to think about. In most instances in the real world, if you allege someone has committed a crime, they're not going to have the person's supervisor investigate them, because the supervisor may have a conflict of interest in thinking that in determining whether or not their own employee did something wrong. They normally have an external source come in and do the investigation. The police, in most instances, police themselves. So the police officer's immediate supervisor will do the initial investigation. When that supervisor completes the investigation, they recommend discipline. They can send it to internal affairs for separate investigation. And then they also report it out to the agency head. And as I indicated before, the employer's direct supervisor conducts the preliminary, sort of fact finding to see whether or not there's sufficient evidence to support the complaint. And then if there's more investigation that is needed, that's when it goes to the internal IA investigators to do additional investigation. The kinds of dispositions: unfounded, exonerated, which means found to be innocent. There's a difference between being found not guilty and being found innocent. Not guilty is that there's not sufficient evidence to prove that you did anything wrong. Not guilty is that we found affirmative evidence to prove that you are in fact not guilty of the alleged violation. Not sustained is another way of saying not sufficient evidence. Finding that there was misconduct, but not the misconduct that was raised in the complaint. Closed case is similar to exonerated, and then sustained is where they've actually found the violation and now they're just making decisions about what the appropriate remedy would be. In most instances, police officers do have a right to appeal a disciplinary measure. And they may be allowed either labor union representation or an attorney. The kinds of sanctions could be requiring the police officer to participate in counseling, documented oral counseling, letters of reprimand that go into the permanent record, suspensions, transfers, demotion, and termination. There's been a big push or discussion, especially recently, on the defund the police movements is to establish civilian or citizen review boards. The argument is that citizen review boards will provide independent and transparent oversight of policing. This is not a particularly new concept. This has been around for a while. They vary in powers to investigate and punish. And then sometimes there's an argument that the civilian boards are too political because they're appointed by political individuals, and that those appointed to the boards may pursue specific agendas. So that's it. Let's see. That's the lecture for this week. We will be just continue to look within the module. There's going to be either a discussion board or a blog or a series of questions or surveys that we're going to have you participate in. And we'll see you next week. Thank you.